Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Lads on Tour. I'm Stars of COVID, and with me tonight are my two regular co-hosts, Dr. Ivor Brent Lee.
Hey.
And Brent Lee.
Howdy.
And also with us tonight is Dr. Viki, a lecturer in Reproductive Immunology, and she's based in Imperial College in London. Has a PhD from the University of Cambridge on NK cells, which I don't think mean North Korean cells in human pregnancy.
Although they almost might as well mean North Korean cell, because it stands for natural killer. But when you're pregnant, they don't kill. We should call them something else.
And we're very excited to have Viki this evening with us, because Viki is, you heard that introduction. There's nobody I can think of who's better placed to demolish some of the stuff around COVID vaccination and pregnancy, which we've all heard of. So I'm going to pass over to Ivor, who will be leading the interrogation this evening. We'll see if Viki can stand up to this brutal interrogation.
Yeah. So the sort of first topic we have tonight is this petition which was signed early on last year from Dr. Michael Yeadon and Wodarg. It's about how syncytin is going to cause infertility in women by reacting with the placenta.
Okay, well, this is really interesting, actually, because this is really what brought me from my day job, which is looking at how immune cells in the lining of the uterus actually help a pregnancy to succeed, into this whole space around COVID vaccines and what effect they might have on fertility in pregnancy. And I want to lead, just in case anyone who's listening gets bored and tunes out, with the real information, the good information, before we start talking about the misinformation. Because we have 5 studies in IVF clinics. We have 1 large study of people trying to conceive naturally. We have information from the clinical trials that tell us that COVID vaccines do not stop anyone from getting pregnant. We have information showing that they don't do anything to your sperm, but they won't stop you getting anyone pregnant. And we also have information from 23 studies that have been done in 7 countries with more than 240,000 people now who've been vaccinated while they're pregnant, showing that COVID vaccines do no harm if you're already pregnant when you get them. So we know all of that now, and it's really important, I think, to lead with it. But let's now get back to Michael Yeadon and Wolfgang Wodarg, and where all of these rumours that COVID vaccines would be bad for fertility and pregnancy came from. And so you were right to say that they kind of emerged, well, you said at the beginning of last year, they actually emerged in December of 2020, when they sent this letter to the European Medicines Agency. They wanted the trials, the mRNA COVID vaccines stopped, and they actually listed a whole bunch of reasons, only one of which was this one to do with syncytin 1. But that was the one that really captured people's imagination. And that was partly as well because this blog post came out and it said something like, President of Pfizer says that COVID vaccines will sterilize women. And actually that didn't even represent what Yeadon and Wodarg had said. They had said that there might be an effect and it might be temporary, and also it didn't represent what Yeadon was, because he wasn't the head of Pfizer research. He had worked at Pfizer until 2011. He didn't work there now, and he wasn't particularly the head of anything. But this blog post, which was taken down after a couple of days, it kind of circulated on WhatsApp, kind of in the dark almost, so that people like me couldn't see it for a long time and address it. And I think that this is where a lot of these rumours come from. So what Yeadon and Wodarg said was that they thought that the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is the same thing that we put into the vaccine, they thought that that was similar enough to a protein called syncytin 1, which is important for the formation of the placenta, that if we vaccinate people against COVID so that they raise an antibody response against the spike, then that could also raise an antibody response against syncytin 1. And that could potentially cause problems for the placenta, which could prevent implantation, that would be infertility. And they also said, that might cause miscarriages early on in pregnancy. Now, even when they said it, we had evidence that it wasn't true. For a start, syncytin 1 and spike are hardly similar at all. Spike is similar to pretty much every other protein in your body as it is to spike. So they weren't really very similar in the first place. But also, if antibodies against spike cross-reacted with syncytin in the placenta, then we would expect that people who had COVID infection, who therefore had antibodies to spike, would also have this cross-reaction problem. And that would mean that after you had COVID, you would be infertile, or after you had COVID, you wouldn't be able to become pregnant. And even in December of 2020, we knew that that wasn't true because lots of people had COVID and gone on to become pregnant. So we knew it was even not true even then. We also knew even then from the clinical trials, people were asked in the trials not to become pregnant, but these were really big trials and, accidents happen. So a handful of people did become pregnant. They became pregnant equally, whether they were in the vaccinated group or in the control group. So we have data from the clinical trials telling us that vaccination doesn't harm fertility. And as the vaccines have been rolled out, we get more and more real-world evidence. So we first of all got it from IVF clinics, looking at people who are vaccinated compared to not vaccinated. Do people who are vaccinated have any more trouble getting pregnant through IVF? 5 studies say no. And now we have really good evidence where they follow people who are trying to conceive naturally through intercourse. And they've said, does it make a difference if you're vaccinated or if you're not vaccinated? Again, no, it makes no difference if you're vaccinated or not to the chance that you'll become pregnant. So we have all of that information, but this is something that kind of really took a hold of the way that people thought about the vaccines. And what's really interesting, particularly to me, is that, as this IVF information and these fertility studies started to come out, I thought, oh, well, that's really knocked those claims on the head. I guess we're going to stop talking about them. But it's almost like whack-a-mole, because as soon as that one was knocked on the head, more claims popped up.
Yeah, this is definitely something that we've noticed, and we spoke about with Dr. Botley a couple of episodes ago, that we were able to go from least silly to most silly sort of claim, and it is like one goes and the other one appears. I didn't realise there's 2 things that you said there I didn't realise about that letter. One, that it got taken off a blog post, so you couldn't even see it to reply to it, and 2, that there was just a stream of stuff. I thought it was all this and sitting, so that's really interesting.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah.
So that was absolutely fantastic, your explanation there. We'll move
I've got one thing to say about it though. Nicki Minaj, though, her cousin.
Nicki Minaj's cousin's balls, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Nicki Minaj's
friend,
cousins,
Right,
husbands, sisters, postman's balls.
And on this podcast, we care about balls because that's where the pee is stored.
So it's really easy for me as someone who works in female fertility to really focus on female fertility. And it's easy for me because this is where these rumours started, centred around female fertility, to focus on that. But you're right, there have definitely been rumours around male fertility. And it's interesting to me that actually they really exploded after the Nicki Minaj's cousin's balls thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say that they weren't there before, because I was talking before to, I would say probably for every 20 young women I was talking to who were worried about the vaccine and fertility, I was talking to one young man. So it was there before, but it was not big. And it kind of took off after the cousin's husband's ball thing. But we do have evidence also on male fertility. And this is really interesting, actually, and really worth knowing. So there have been 2 studies done in fertility clinics showing that there's no difference in sperm quality before versus after vaccination. There is one study that has been done with upstanding young volunteers showing that there is no difference in sperm quality before and after vaccination. And then the study that I talked about that looked at couples who were trying to conceive through intercourse, it looked at whether the male partner had been vaccinated and whether the female partner had been vaccinated. So it was also able to say that vaccination makes no difference to the chance that you will get your partner pregnant. But what's really interesting about that study is they also looked at the effect of COVID. And COVID doesn't actually reduce the chance that the female partner will become pregnant, but it does reduce the chance that the male partner will be able to get you pregnant for about 2 months. So if you catch COVID as a male, your fertility is reduced for 2 months. And that makes sense with what we know about COVID and sperm, because we know that when you catch COVID, your sperm count and quality is decreased temporarily. So it completely makes sense. I think so many people don't necessarily know this. So they're sitting there worrying about the vaccine. But if what you want to do is get your partner pregnant, then actually you really want to avoid COVID, and getting vaccinated is one way that you can avoid COVID.
Yeah, I've heard that it causes problems that might be fixed by males getting blue pilled.
That was a really great explanation, because another thing it connects to is the sort of conspiracy theory where, you know, Bill Gates is deliberately attempting to depopulate the earth with vaccines, is where, you know, you sort of start with, oh, it might make you not able to get pregnant, and then it can end up escalating to that more extreme view there. So we'll move on to our next topic. The way this one is normally phrased, leaked Pfizer report from Japan proves that spike protein collects in the ovaries and causes infertility.
So I don't actually know that this report has been leaked. I don't know the extent to which it's been leaked. And this actually comes back to something I'm seeing a lot at the moment. So there was a Freedom of Information request that was made to the FDA, and the FDA was asked to put out all the documents that Pfizer had given it in the course of licensing the vaccine. And that was going to be quite slow because it's got a lot of people's personal information in. Every document has to be gone through to make sure that, you know, you don't accidentally give out the medical details of one of your trial volunteers, of course. And that was going to take a while, and it was going to take really quite a long time, actually. And so to speed it up, they took on some extra staff. And that's kind of what gives rise to this idea that they were trying to keep it under wraps for 75 years or something. It's just that it was going to take that long to go through them until they took on the extra staff. But what's really interesting now is those documents are coming out kind of like 80,000 pages every couple of months at the moment. And every time some new ones come out, people will say like, oh, this one's come out in the most recent drop of documents. And then they'll point me to something that's a UK government document from December 2020, or in this case, this document that was sent by Pfizer to the Japanese government and isn't going to be in the FDA drops. And it's really interesting to me that we always get this misattribution, I guess because, you know, people who are putting this about want to tie what they're saying to a kind of newsy event, which is the 80,000 pages that have come out, but they can't because actually it wasn't in the 80,000 pages. So these documents that weren't really leaked basically were Japan said to Pfizer, okay, we like the look of your vaccine, it's stopping people getting COVID, which is great, but we would like to know a little bit more about how it behaves in the body. And obviously we can't do that in people, but what we can do is we can do some more experiments in rats and mice. And so Pfizer did 2 series of experiments that they submitted to the Japanese government separately from the submissions that they made to, for example, the US and the UK governments. And one of those, they used a version of the vaccine that instead of making spike protein, it makes a protein called luciferase. And luciferase is basically an enzyme that glows. And it causes your mice, when you give it to them, to glow in the places where the vaccine, if you'd given them the vaccine, would be expressed. And not surprisingly, we see about 80% of the glow in the hind leg of the mouse, which is where they gave them the injection. But we do also see some glow in the liver. So some of it ends up being processed in the liver and actually causing protein to be made in the liver. And one important thing to say about this is that it wasn't a surprise. There are papers from back in 2015 when these vaccines were first being developed that kind of said, well, it's really important for us to know how they behave. Let's do these experiments. And they found it going to the liver. So anyone who claims that we thought it was staying in the arm and it turns out it's not, just hasn't looked at those early development papers of the vaccine. So we find it at the site of injection mostly, a little bit in the liver. And then they did a second set of experiments where they said, okay, well, we'd also be interested to know where the lipids from the vaccine end up. So what they did there was they radio-labeled, so they labeled with radioactive chemicals, the fats that have been used to make the lipid nanoparticles for the vaccine. And they injected those into, in this set of experiments, it was rats. And they took a look at where the radioactivity ended up, because that tells us where the fat ends up. It doesn't actually tell us where the vaccine ends up necessarily. Those fat particles could just be broken up fat, but it could be vaccine. And in line with what we found with the luciferase experiments, the vaccine lipids mostly stay at the site of injection. They also go to the liver, but you can find small amounts of radioactivity in these experiments pretty much all over the body. But what someone did was they took the data and they scrubbed out the site of injection and they scrubbed out the liver, which are really high. And if you don't show that, then all the really low amounts that were in other organs suddenly start to look a lot higher. And actually, in preparation for this podcast, I went back to that graph. And I also noticed that they changed the axis to make it look like there was a lot more than there was, because the axis should have been in hundredths of a percent, but they don't label it as hundredths of a percent. They just label it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which, obviously is pretty misleading. But doing this, it made it look like there was a reasonable amount turning up in the bone marrow and in the ovaries. And this is what led to this idea that the vaccine was building up in the ovaries. But actually, the evidence didn't support that. You couldn't see it by luciferase in the ovaries. And having seen this data, the Japanese government said, okay, thank you for the additional data. We will now approve it for the Japanese people. And they're quite strict as a regulator, and they're also quite worried about fertility. So this is something that really came from someone taking the data that was put out there and just misrepresenting it.
I've noticed that they crop a lot of the tables when they show that data, yeah. Also, I don't know if you're aware, but there is a conspiracy theory that because there's luciferase used, that, the vaccine is of the devil or satanic or something like that.
Yeah.
Is that one?
That was the alarm bells going off in my head.
It's amazing because it's both terrible theology and terrible science at the same time, because lucifer literally means light bearer. So of course, stuff to do with light is going to have a similar sounding name. I mean, great.
Yeah, and that's why it's called luciferase. I can't really comment on the theology. That is definitely outside of my domain. But so
it's outside there to mean too, Viki. Sorry, continue.
I've heard that one, and kind of from your point of view, do you think that one's like widely believed? Because I feel like I've only ever heard it as a joke, but are there people out there who think it's not a joke, who think it's a real thing?
There definitely is. I think Kate Shermani, and it's more of a hardcore trope than like some of the lower level ones. Yeah,
it's more up my alley.
Yeah, but this is interesting though, because presumably it requires you to think, these people know that they're doing something bad, and they're going to give us all a hint of that in the name of the protein. That's really interesting, because you would have thought that if you had this global conspiracy, you'd be working quite hard to not let people know, right?
Yes.
Yeah, no, it's important whenever you're doing a global conspiracy that you come up with patterns that are so obvious that two hit wonders can work it out.
Yeah, right, said Fred.
Oh, I thought he was talking about us.
No.
So the other question, though. So I can't remember who it was that said it, but this was an interesting question. Like, did they do that on purpose? And this is something that I almost struggle with, trying to work out what the motivation is behind doing these things. And I think the motivations are many and varied. I don't know if this is where it started, but there was a particular person who picked this one up, who was a science professor over in Canada or the States, Dr. Brindle. And he picked this one up and he really pushed it quite hard. And what it's worth saying there is that he's developing his own competing vaccine. So, you can see a motivation there, but I don't think it was actually him who came up with the kind of misrepresented graph. I think that was generated a bit more organically, and I just don't know why you would do that. Do you think you found something interesting that's hidden beneath the real data? Are you just doing it for laughs? I really struggle to try and work out what people's motivations are here.
Yeah, I wonder if people think that the end justifies the means. So if they've decided this is unsafe, then they'll throw whatever they can find at it.
Absolutely.
I don't know.
That is a common thread in like the conspiracy world. People who believe it will make up lies just to make you believe these things. I've seen it a million times.
So do you think that a lot of the people who are saying this, they think, actually, I don't think it will cause infertility, but I'm worried about it for other reasons, and so I'm going to use this argument, which I know is shaky, to try and convince people?
Yeah, I do believe a lot of the influencers are like that. The normal believers, I don't think that they do. They're just happy to pass on whatever like the authority has passed on to them. I definitely do think that the influencers know exactly what they're doing, and that's when it's disinformation. When the believers are passing on, it's misinformation. Exactly,
yeah. I also say, like, with the influencers, there's mass financial incentive. Like, Joe McCullough has $100 million, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has 50 million, Andrew Wakefield has got like 10 million. It's exceptionally lucrative for them.
Yeah, and you mentioned about Brindle having a competing vaccine, and that is, of course, how I'm not hitting the explicit button in this podcast. That's how the and fraud Wakefield got started.
Yes.
Looking to make a monovariant set of vaccines.
Yeah, it's interesting sort of, themes come up, I guess. And one of the interesting things about vaccines and fertility is, us living through this might think, oh, this is weird. Why all the fuss about vaccines and fertility? This is not the first vaccine where there have been rumours this will do something to your fertility. It's not even the fifth. This is something that comes up over and over and over again. And over and over again, there's no problem, because actually, why would there be? And yet, when the next vaccine comes up, the whole thing comes up again.
Yeah, the classic one has got to be the Kenya tetanus in the 90s story. That one just never dies. It's always recycled every couple of months.
Yeah.
As well, I should mention before we move on, it's not a leaked document, what we were talking about there. It's a published document. It's just they put leaked in to sort of make it more dramatic when they, yeah. So we'll get on to, one of the most common tropes. It's that there's miscarriage in Veyers and yellow card. That proves the vaccines have caused those issues.
So I think it's first of all really important to talk about what I never know. Do we say Veyers? Do we say Vears? I've been writing it for like 2 years and I have no idea how to pronounce it. But luckily, our homegrown version is super easy to pronounce, which is the yellow card. And there's also eutrovigilance in the EU. So most places have a version of this. What is it? Well, basically, it's so for yellow card, since we're all sitting here in Britain, let's talk about our version. The yellow card. It covers all medicines, and it actually also covers herbal remedies. And if, when you're having any medicine, or after you've had a vaccine, or if you've taken a herbal remedy, and something bad happens to you, you can tell yellow card. And you don't necessarily have to have any evidence, or even believe that the something bad that has happened to you is due to the vaccine, or the medicine, or the herbal remedy. It's just that you tell yellow card about it. And in particular, your doctor might tell yellow card about it if the medicine you were taking was one that has been flagged up by the British National Formulary as being new or as being one that was under kind of special monitoring. So we tell the yellow card about, pretty much everything. And that means that yellow card has a great big long list of things that have happened to people in the case of COVID vaccination shortly after they got vaccinated. Not necessarily caused by the vaccine, but after they got vaccinated. And this basically acts as an early warning system. So loads of things are in the yellow card that are happening at exactly the rate that you would normally expect. I took the vaccine and then I had a heart attack, but, I'm 78 and that sometimes happens. And it's not happening at any greater rate with the vaccine than it is with anything else, or if you hadn't had the vaccine. But this is a very good way of spotting things that are usually really, really rare, that suddenly become much more common after you've had a vaccine or a medicine, even if those things are still very, very rare. So using yellow card and the AERS, for example, we managed to find the very rare clotting side effect, which happens with the AstraZeneca vaccine. And it is really pretty rare. It happens about 1 in every 26 to 125,000 doses of the vaccine. So it's rare, but we were able to spot it. The problem with yellow card and VEARS is that it can't distinguish between things that are caused by the vaccine and things that just happen to happen by chance. To find that out, we need to do follow-up studies, and particularly for things like miscarriages, which are really common anyway. We find it very difficult to tell the difference between ones that would have happened anyway and an increased rate because there's something bad going on. And we also have the opposite problem, which is that for something like miscarriages that are very common anyway, not all of them will get reported to yellow card or VEARS because people go, 1 in 5 pregnancies end in miscarriage. I have no reason to believe it's got anything to do with the vaccine. So for things like miscarriage, and also things like preterm birth, which are also pretty common, 1 in 10 pregnancies that go that go past 20 weeks will end in preterm birth. We actually have to do different kinds of studies. We have to do studies where we actively track people so that we don't miss any miscarriages. but also so that we know really accurately what the rate of miscarriage is. And then we can compare that to either what the rate was before the pandemic or what the rate is in unvaccinated people. And we can get a good idea of whether vaccination increases the risk of miscarriage or preterm birth or stillbirth or postpartum hemorrhage or pretty much any obstetric problem you've ever heard of, we have looked at. And the answer is no. And actually, I don't know if you guys know, but big news in the obstetric field, a systematic review and meta-analysis came out about 2 weeks ago in Nature Communications that put all of these studies together. It had data from about 127,000 people who've been vaccinated while they were pregnant. And you put that all together, it makes you much more able to spot small differences. Mm-hmm. And they couldn't see any increased risk of preterm birth or miscarriage. For stillbirth, COVID vaccination decreases the risk that you will have a stillbirth. Yeah. And that's really important, actually, when we're talking about misinformation, because statistically, if you convince enough people not to get the COVID vaccine while they're pregnant, some of those people will have a COVID-related stillbirth that might have been avoided had they gone ahead and got the vaccine, which is what obstetricians and gynecologists and midwives would recommend.
My favourite thing about BARS is that there is an item in there, which again I can't say without causing me having to take the explicit button, but it makes a meal 10 times blessed was one of the side effects.
And you know, so one thing that I did before we had these formal studies, and God knows why I did this to myself, but I did this from January to about May, was I used to, unlike Yellow Card, which comes out as a summary every week, the VARS reports, you can actually read the raw reports.
Yeah, they're amazing.
And until there was, sufficient formal data, every week I used to read the VARS reports that were related to pregnancy. And some of them I just loved. And actually, none of them were nonsense, but some of them were people coming in being like, I had the vaccine and everything was fine. And I'm making a report just because I want you to know that everything was fine for me. And there were so many of those. They were so sweet. And there was one that was like, I had the vaccine. I got these weird spots on my tongue. I don't know what that was. Weird. But I just thought I'd let you know. And you're like, thank you, actually, for reporting, because that's how the system works. If these weird spots on my tongue had in fact been a proper side effect, the only way we would have known is if people like her had come on and made those reports. So I actually, it was hard work, but I really loved reading the VARS reports. It was just sort of, a real spread of humanity being their best, I thought.
You have actually been quoted, I don't know if you know, in a website called the Daily Expose, which, if you didn't know, is a website which endorses Bill Gates is depopulating the earth with vaccine, AIDS doesn't exist, and global warming is a hoax, and stuff like that. It's really, really fringe, but it actually
so a very well trusted source.
Yeah, it actually quoted you. It actually quoted you in one of their articles. So they said that you said this supposedly in September 2021.
Well, do you know what? So you sent me that and I went and I was like, what are they going to say I've said? And actually they were quoting me verbatim. I've got to give them their due there. But what was kind of annoying, so they started with this, Japan ovary story that we've already talked about. And then they started talking about how there were people reporting changes to their periods after they were vaccinated in the yellow card. And this is another example of a place where the yellow card can give us a clue that we need to look at something, but we can't make any conclusions on it at all on its own. Because periods change all the time anyway, for lots of reasons. They can change because you're stressed, they can change because you've lost weight, because you've gained weight, because you're entering the menopause, they can change for loads of reasons. So it's really difficult to separate out those normal changes that would have happened anyway for the vaccine-related changes. But nonetheless, enough people were reporting this that I started to think, well, in fact, I thought for a while by the time I wrote that editorial in the BMJ, that actually a formal investigation should be done. And everything they said in that Daily Expose article was quoting me verbatim. I thought it was plausible. Actually, it is plausible. It does happen, I'll tell you. And it should be investigated. What kind of annoyed me about that, though, was I noticed that article was published in March of 2020. So I called for more research to be done in September of 2021, and more research was done, including by me. And I felt a lot of attention was paid to that call for more research. And when the research had been done, I felt that I ought to come back and tell the BMJ what the results of it had been, since everyone had been so interested to know. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, the results were really reassuring, and therefore no one paid that much attention to them. But at the point that the Daily Expose quoted me as saying more research should be done, they could have quoted the follow-up article which said, hey guys, more research has been done, and actually there's not a lot to worry about here. So to tell you a bit about that research, actually, it was the biggest and the best study. Is nothing to do with me, so I can blow its trumpet here. It was done by someone called Alison Edelman in the States and her team. And what they did was they used menstrual cycle tracking data from one of these apps that people use to track their periods. And that's really, really good because it meant that there was no kind of expectation in the study population that the vaccine would change their periods. You didn't get a cohort that was enriched for people that particularly wanted to tell a story about the vaccine changing their periods, which some experimental approaches does. And that basically found that after the first dose of the vaccine, it didn't do anything. After the second dose of the vaccine, on average, it delays the next period by half a day. And if, as is the case in America, but not the case in the UK because of how our schedule works, you get both doses in a single cycle, then you actually see a reasonably significant delay of, on average, 2.5 days. So actually, as it goes, the vaccines were making small changes to the period after you have them. The study also showed that they went back to normal within 2 cycles. So actually, the people who said, I feel like I've noticed a change, were right, but the changes were small, the changes reversed quickly. And as we've already discussed, there's no effect on fertility. This was also quite important, actually, because it allows us to give, in some ways, the converse advice as well. If someone says, I had the vaccine and then my period stopped and I haven't had one for 6 months, because of this information, we can say, well, that's probably not the vaccine. Something else is probably going on. You ought to get that checked out. And so the advice is, if you see any persistent change after vaccination, evidence says it's probably not the vaccine. You ought to get it checked out.
I'm pretty sure it was in VARS, maybe in yellow card, but there was a report of somebody who had a dose of vaccine. She reported that her periods had moved slightly, and her partner were using rhythm to refrain from pregnancy, and obviously there was a mistimed tackle, and she became pregnant as a result. So that's the vaccine improving fertility, right?
It is, but it is actually, that was in fact in my original article where I said we really need to know this.
Yeah,
one of the reasons I said was because unplanned pregnancies are not a good thing, and if people are using the rhythm method and the vaccine messes up their rhythm, then they need to know that they need an alternative form of contraception that month. Mm-hmm. Now, this hasn't been published, so I sort of can't necessarily say it to you formally, but I am aware of some evidence that actually even this very short delay and basically the rhythm method, which broadly speaking I don't endorse, but if you do the rhythm method, it doesn't seem to make a difference the month you've been vaccinated on a population basis.
Yeah, it strikes me that it's probably not if you're super serious about not having a child, it's probably not the best. So you get all sorts of great advice in this channel.
You should get my advice on how you get pregnant if you want to get. Actually, no, you probably shouldn't.
I use my personality to avoid pregnancies, and that works brilliantly.
I think we all do. All right, so on that note, let's get on to the next topics. Supposedly, the claim is there was a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine which said that vaccines cause an 83% miscarriage rate.
Yeah, so this is really interesting because this is another claim that just won't die, and it's really interesting because I've heard this precise number coming backed up by 3 different wrong ways of doing maths from 3 different sources. But this particular wrong way of doing maths, or actually it's not even wrong way of doing maths, it's kind of just like forgetting about a whole chunk of people in your population and not counting them in. So what happened here was there was a paper in March of 2021, and the lead author was Tom Shimabukuro, who works for the CDC. And in America, unlike here, they offered the vaccines in pregnancy from the get-go. They said, we know that COVID, if you're pregnant, can cause stillbirth. We know that it can cause preterm birth. These are really bad and we want to avoid them. And we have no reason from the animal studies or from anything we know about vaccines to suspect that the vaccine would cause a problem in pregnancy. So let's offer it, and people can make their own choices. As a result of which, quite a lot of people in the USA did choose to become vaccinated when they were pregnant. And by the end of February, there were about 4,000 such people who had joined a register called the VSafe Pregnancy Registry, where they had effectively, when they got vaccinated, they had signed up to an app that would ping them every day to ask them about any symptoms they were having. And then they would get telephoned, not every day, but periodically to check how their pregnancy was going. Are you still pregnant? Is everything okay? So there are about 4,000 people in that registry by the end of February. And in March of 2021, the CDC published this data in the New England Journal of Medicine. And this was actually the first formal study we had of vaccine safety in pregnancy. And it's the study that caused countries like the UK and Canada, who had not been offering the vaccine in pregnancy, to change their policy in April. It was April the 18th that we started offering it to everyone who was pregnant. So among these, it was 3,958 people who'd been vaccinated while they were pregnant. 712 of them had had happy, healthy babies. There had been one stillbirth, and there had been 104 miscarriages. But you'll notice that those numbers don't add up to nearly 3,958, and that's because everyone else was still pregnant. Of course they were. You're pregnant for ages. It certainly feels that way at the time. So in the first version of the paper, the authors had tried to work out what the miscarriage rate was. But that's really difficult when loads of people are still pregnant. So what they'd said is, okay, we're going to just look at the pregnancies that are over. And there were 824 of those. And of those 824, 104 had ended in miscarriage. So that gives us a miscarriage rate of 12.5%. And actually, that's roughly normal. It's a little bit on the low end of normal, in fact. Usually, we would say about 12.5% to 18.5% of pregnancies end in miscarriage. But the counter-argument to the way that that was presented was that lots of those people who had been vaccinated after the point at which they could have miscarried. They were vaccinated, say, in the third trimester. So is it fair to count them in the denominator of that calculation? And actually, the answer is probably not. We can use the data in that paper to calculate the miscarriages on completed first trimesters, which were about 8.5%, or completed second trimesters, which was about 0.5%. But actually, I think it would have been fairer to say on this study, look, this is a 3-month follow-up because it was important to get this data out. We don't have enough data. We don't have enough follow-up to do this analysis properly, and we need to come back to the question later. And actually, in a second version of that paper that was released in August, that's exactly what they did. They came back to the same people. They said, okay, we followed them up until the point that they can't miscarry anymore. And we've worked out the week-by-week miscarriage rate, and we know what it is. But in the interim, this person called Deanna McLeod decides to have a go. And what she does is she says, okay, well, it's not really fair to count the third trimester vaccinations in the denominator. If we take them out, we have 104 miscarriages out of 127 people who were vaccinated in the first and second trimester, but who weren't pregnant 3 months later. And that's 83%. But what that actually tells us is it's a very specific and not particularly helpful statistic, because it says out of 127 people who were vaccinated in the first or the second trimester, and who, when we came back 3 months later, were no longer pregnant, most of them had had a miscarriage. But of course, that's what we would expect, whether they were vaccinated or not, because human pregnancy takes 9 months and they just weren't followed up for long enough to complete the pregnancy, except if they had miscarried. And that's because in the study, most of the people were still pregnant. And this was another interesting bit of sort of like an amuse-bouche of misinformation, because they used a very particular technique to put this one about. They wrote a letter to the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, kind of putting this argument. And I saw the letter on Twitter, not in the New England Journal of Medicine, and I was like, this is so obviously wrong. I can't believe the New England Journal of Medicine would publish it. So I went to the New England Journal of Medicine, and of course they hadn't published it. What they had done was they had taken a screenshot of the letter from their end and, they're showing you what they sent. They're not necessarily showing you that the New England Journal of Medicine agrees at all.
Right.
So that was such an interesting misinformation dodge to me.
Yeah.
And then what was also shocking to me a little bit later is that there was an academic in, I can't remember now if it was Australia or New Zealand, and he just lifted this analysis and published it as a scientific paper in November when there was tons of evidence to show that it was no longer the case. And this annoyed me, you know, not just from a misinformation point of view, but also this really got my academic going, because I was like, that's not even an original wrong analysis. He's copied his wrong analysis off of Twitter.
Lazy.
That is just, yeah, it's a lazy wrong analysis. So that was another one. It got retracted 2 weeks later because of being wrong. But the fact that it was published briefly in a journal that people who know it assure me is not really a journal, but nonetheless, you know, that boosted this whole story again. And it came after, you know, after I thought it had died, it came roaring out of the woodwork again in November.
My final topic is there was this whole thing with regards to if a vaccinated woman breastfeeds her baby, it's going to result in, you know, there was a Thayer's report that one baby had died because of this, and this is going to cause all these problems. So your take on that?
Yeah, so that was an interesting one, and this brings up actually another potential problem with, I'm going to go with Thayer's since that seems to be the consensus on this podcast. In some ways, it's really good that anyone can submit a report because it means there's not a barrier to submitting a report. You know, you don't have to convince your doctor to submit one, you can just submit one. But it also means that people can put things into Thayer's that just didn't happen. And it's really hard to prove that this appears to have been the case with this particular story because it appears first on Facebook without the Thayer's information. And that was identified very clearly as being not vaccine related because the nurse who was involved came on and was like, I can't believe you're using this picture and saying it's a vaccine problem because actually it wasn't. And then someone seems to have taken the information from the Facebook post and put it into Thayer's. So not the patient or a doctor or anyone. So it started on Facebook, moves into Thayer's, and then that is used to kind of legitimize further posts that kind of combine the original Facebook post, which has already had the person involved say like, no, this wasn't a vaccine thing, with the Thayer's to kind of legitimize it. Now, obviously, really difficult for me to say for certain that that's what's happening, but it really seems to have been what's happened based on the timing of when everything appears on the internet in a timestamp way.
It was later removed from Thayer's for being fraudulent.
Was it? There you go. You're better informed than I am. So they actually went and they tried to track down the person, and the person just didn't exist.
It must have been a shockingly bad report if it got removed from Thayer's. There's so much crap in there.
So, I mean, the short answer with that particular one, right, is it's just a plain old fake report, and I guess it's a really good example of a fake report. But to take on the issue of breastfeeding more generally, because we haven't really talked about that before, and it's so easy to forget about it, actually, because we get so focused on pregnancy, particularly people like me who work on pregnancy. There have been some formal studies done into breastfeeding and the vaccine. And what they found is that if you're breastfeeding, you get the same kind of side effects that anyone else gets. So, you know, you might feel a bit feverish, might feel a bit generally malaisy at the same rate as everyone else. No evidence that it does anything to babies. And the reason for that is that people have looked quite hard at breast milk to see if they can find any vaccine in breast milk. And most studies are unable to find any vaccine in breast milk. There was one that sort of concentrated it many thousands of fold using a formaldehyde-based technique. And then doing that was able to find in, I think, 3 out of 10 people, an amount that was equivalent to, and I'm going to reveal myself here as both a mother and someone who spends a lot of time speaking to mothers. So it's equivalent to 2.5 mils in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. To visualize 2.5 mils, you imagine the Calpol syringe that you would use to give your baby Calpol. It is half a syringe in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Give it a big old mix, and then take another 2.5 mils out of the swimming pool. And in that one study that concentrated the milk in 3 out of 10 people, that's how much they were able to find. So I've got to say, even if it was there, I wouldn't worry that much about that level of it.
The Olympics would be a bit different.
I mean, maybe giving babies Calpol, if it were an Olympic event, legitimately that would be my event. I'm amazing at giving babies Calpol.
No, my joke I was going to go with was actually if the swimming pool was full of breast milk, but
that would be stickier than you would expect.
I'm interested in what everybody thinks about this. So obviously we've got Dr. Mill on this evening, and she knows what she's talking about, and that's great. And we've had, on one side we've had a few experts who know what they're on about and who we trust. But some of the people who have raised some of these issues that we've all had a giggle at, Dr. Yeadon, what was his name?
Wodog. He was
Wodog,
mostly a politician, though, actually. He was medically trained, but he was mostly a politician. But
crikey. But you've got people who, on the surface of it, have reasonable credentials. Now, I know that Yeadon's massively inflated his credentials, which is obviously a massive red flag. How do you choose who to trust?
I think we should throw this first to Brent and Ivor because, this is something you've got experience of, right?
Yeah, it's a question for everyone. Yeah, absolutely. Let's hear what Brent and Ivor have to say.
What my conspiracy theory was back in the day was the 9/11 one. So that was
classic.
I was studying metallurgy at the time at university, and like a lot of the people in that whole scene were like, PhDs in all kind of related fields. So I thought, these people sound like my lecturers, and they're like speaking in the same terms to what I would have had in my metallurgy classes. So that was what sort of got me into it. What sort of got me out of it was I just found some really good fact-checking videos afterwards from other scientists who were checking it. So I was only in the conspiracy movement for about 4 months during the summer of 2014. Brent was in there a lot longer, so I'll let him just speak now.
Yeah, if you don't know my story, I fell in the rabbit hole back in 2003, and I didn't come back out until 2018. So I was kind of very much QAnon adjacent in the same sort of way that I believed a cabal of dark occultists or black magicians were orchestrating all the main events in the world. There was the depopulation plan. The vaccines were definitely part of a depopulation plan to me. Essentially, there's a soft kill through the pharmaceuticals, through food, through crops and everything like that, basically to slowly kill us off. So I come from a place of really not trusting anybody from the mainstream. I just would have thought, for instance, yourself, Viki, I would have thought you was a paid shill. Straight up, you were just a paid shill from the government or from the BBC or the Royal Hospital or whatever. I just would have thought that no matter what, no more reasoning. You couldn't even reason with me at that point. But today, the way that I kind of tell the difference is not with people talking with authority or talking with their charisma. I look at the people that are consistently telling me facts that are backed up by data, that is backed up by other people saying the exact same things because they've done the same experiments and have produced the same results. That's how I come to trust these people now. I come to trust you, Botley, or if we're talking about the news, the disinformation team with Mariana Spring, I completely trust these people.
That's really interesting, Brent, about with experiments being repeated, which is obviously a big deal. And again, that was one of the things that the fraud, Yeadon, could not have. He wasn't able to have his experiment replicated. The PCR testing that they got done, if it wasn't his mate doing it, it didn't produce the answers he wanted. Whenever he was given an opportunity to have a big study, he ran away. Viki, from a scientific perspective, then, how does a layperson tell the difference between a study that is good and a study that's a big pile of crap?
It is super tough. I think in an ideal world, we would all engage directly with the evidence. But the thing is, no one is qualified to assess all types of evidence.
Yeah.
And even if they were, there's not enough time. Like, just the evidence around vaccination, fertility, pregnancy, and breastfeeding, it takes up a massive amount of my time just to deal with that like tiny sub piece of evidence. And so this is why, experts, and here I'm doing the air quotes, they come in useful because they can summarize findings and they can make recommendations. But then, you get to that question of like, well, how do you decide who are the experts who you'll listen to? If me and the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the Royal College of Midwives are sitting here saying COVID is not safe in pregnancy, but COVID vaccination is safe in pregnancy, you should get vaccinated, how do you know you should listen to us rather than listening to some of the people that are saying the opposite? And I think that something Ivor said is really pertinent here, that misinformation quite often uses the tone and the tools and the structures of information to make it difficult to just quickly be like, well, that's clearly a pile of crap and this is a real study. And this is where something that Brent said has really comes in, which is looking for consensus. And how can we look for consensus? Well, you can do things like have trusted sources, like maybe the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, maybe the NHS. For some people, those won't be trusted sources for some of the reasons that Brent has mentioned. Within science, we can look to see if something has been peer-reviewed. Now, peer review is not perfect. A lot of nonsense gets published after peer review, and a lot of good studies are on preprint servers because they haven't been reviewed yet. But in general, if something has been peer-reviewed and published in a well-respected journal, then that is a good sign. And that's why, again, people like Deanna McLeod will try to sort of borrow, the cachet of, say, the New England Journal of Medicine by saying, well, I've sent them a letter. And well, I'm sure you have, but they've probably put it in the bin, right?
It's still amazing that.
It's a brilliant dodge, right? And then the other thing is that, scientists love nothing more than to talk about their papers and other people's research papers, and are really happy to do so publicly. So you can quite often see the scientists having a discussion with each other. These days, a lot of papers have a function where there are comments on the paper, and the person who's written the paper can come back and be like, well, you've raised an interesting point about how I've done my analysis there, and let me explain a bit more why I'm right and you're wrong. Or sometimes they come along and they say, actually, you're right, and I'm going to amend the paper. You can see that in a lot of journals. You can see scientists talking openly on Twitter about what they think about particular papers. Twitter is kind of where scientists hang out, so not so much Facebook and Instagram. Twitter is the place for this kind of thing. And then the final thing to say, which I don't think has come up before, because all of these are kind of still judgment calls, is my rule of thumb, I guess, is if it sounds too good to be true, or if it sounds too bad to be true, it probably is. It's like a sniff test. Do you feel like someone's pushing your buttons? Like, if we take that claim, 83% of people who get vaccinated have a miscarriage. That's a lot.
Yeah.
I feel like if it was that high, even if you weren't in obs and gynae, you'd know a whole bunch of people who've been vaccinated and have a miscarriage. And we don't. You feel like even if we imagine there's a conspiracy where the BBC wouldn't tell you about it, it would be everywhere. You wouldn't be able to get away from it. That's an example of a claim that's too bad to be true. And so that for me is kind of like the final test. That's the test that kind of stops me when I see something. I'm like, oh, does that, if that was really true, would we really not notice? Would the only way I could find out about it really be Twitter? And that's the time when you start to, because I think asking yourself that question and starting to look at alternative sources, that's actually the first step and probably the most important step. As soon as you're looking at alternative sources, you're halfway there. And then you have to decide which of the sources you trust and which of the ones you don't. But you're halfway there.
Yeah. Cool.
What about you, Stars? Right back at you.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's. I can't believe I just described my own question as a good question. What a tool! What a narcissist! I think that the consensus is important. I think one of the things which it at least lets somebody see that whoever the thing comes from is interested in truth is if somebody has an amount of humility. If I see, if you look at, we'll go back to Wakefield, he's the prime example, right?
Mm.
Everybody's wrong, and there was this mock humility, but everyone's wrong except me, and I've got this great vaccine, and blah, 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 bit of a savior complex going on there. I know that's not going to appear in any papers, but it sets my alarm bells off. And sometimes people are arrogant and right. So, I mean, that's obviously not a perfect answer, far from it. I do think that the stuff that's been mentioned around consensus is important, that if 20 people have done a similar study and they've got similar results, and there's one study that they've done a study and it turns out the moon is made out of cheese, that's a bit weird. But even that isn't perfect, right? I mean, there's been times whenever the majority of you has been incorrect on things. So I think all you can do is sort of raise the bar, lower the bar appropriately, depending on these things. But I don't know that the bar ever gets to an insurmountable height. If somebody, even if they've got a crap reputation and they've been involved in nonsense before, if they come out with a paper and that paper is correct, then it's correct. But that's really unlikely to happen. And I'm not interested in doing, I'll be honest, at this point, I'm not interested in doing anything other than dismissing everything that Mike Heath says out of hand until somebody tells me otherwise, because everything he said so far has been total garbage.
But it's interesting, actually, because you said that, if someone who's produced a lot of nonsense suddenly does something that's technically correct, we'll go for it, which is absolutely true, and it's science, because you judge the science and not the scientist. But actually what happens more often, I think, is the opposite. And this is why we do have to be really cautious of I'm going to air quotes, experts again. And this is why I don't like to say, I'm an expert, you should believe me. I like to say, here are the papers. Please do look at the papers.
Yes.
And it's because there have been so many people, particularly recently, who have, done amazing things in their field, maybe 20 years ago, and then have suddenly, come out with all of this stuff that's wrong. And again,
yes.
It's really interesting to me why, are some people losing their faculties? Are some people being paid to do this? Are there financial reasons for it? But this is why we do have to be cautious, because people can have done great work for decades, but you're only as good as the next thing you produce. And if the next thing you produce is, nonsense, then we've got to not believe it.
Well, a great example of that is, I'm going to mangle his name, and I apologise, that's not deliberate. Luc Montagnier, who discovered AIDS.
That is who I was thinking of, yeah.
Became a homeopath. What the?
Yeah.
What are you doing,
died
son?
A few months ago.
Yeah. It is very sad whenever that happens. I don't even think he's the only Nobel Prize winner who's won.
Yep, Kerry Mullis.
Yeah, oh, yes, Kerry Mullis, yeah.
It's actually a known phenomenon called the Nobel disease, where exceptionally great scientists sort of embrace really out their ideas in their old age.
But I wonder, this is me as a scientist, is it that that's happening at a greater rate in Nobel winners than in the rest of the population? Or is it just that, 5% of Nobel winners go slightly nuts in their old age, like 5% of all of us?
Yeah.
And we just aren't paying attention to the 95% who are like, I've had a lovely time doing science, but now I'm going to be mostly walking my dogs.
I feel like if somebody could answer that, they might win a Nobel Prize.
They might win an Ig Nobel Prize. I see my contribution to the BMJ Christmas edition, which you may or may not know publishes sort of fun science. There you go. That's my BMJ Christmas edition contribution coming up.
Okay. Well, has anybody got anything else for Viki?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks for coming on as well. I really actually understood pretty much most of the conversation today.
Oh, good. It's always what I aim for.
I'm the least scientific of the bunch. Yeah, you had explained quite a lot to me, and I'm very grateful. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much, Viki. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed listening to things you had to say, and I hope that you enjoyed speaking with us.
Thank you. It's been lovely. It's been lovely being here. All right, guys. Cheerio. Yeah. Night night.
Cheers, Vic. Bye.
So that was Dr. Viki Mail. Well, wasn't she a great guest?
Fantastic.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting how whenever she showed data, just data, bang, 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 and the sniff tested at 83%. Yes, that's absurd on the face of it, and it's important to be able to say that. I guess we need to try to encourage people to like, share, and subscribe the podcast. So I'm going to do a little sing song.
Yeah.
All right then. Yeah.
Like, share, subscribe to Lads on Tour. Tell us what you'd like on Lads on Tour. Subscribe and share and like and thumbs up on your podcast app. It will help a lot. You don't have to make a tune to make that work, Brent. Good luck.
It's all right. I'll play a harmonica or something to it. I loved it, mate. I loved it.
All right, that's great. All right, cool. Well, look, guys, thanks very much. And I guess somebody should thank our audience for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Good night.